The Man in the Iron Mask, by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 11. The Chateau de Vaux-le-Vicomte. The chateau of Vaux-le-Vicomte, situated about a league from Melun, had been built by Fouquet in 1655, at a time when there was a scarcity of money in France. Mazarin had taken all that there was, and Fouquet expended the remainder. However, as certain men have fertile, false, and useful vices, Fouquet, in scattering broadcast millions of money in the construction of this palace, had found a means of gathering, as the result of his generous profusion, three illustrious men together: Louveau, the architect of the building; Nectar, the designer of the gardens; and Lebrun, the decorator of the apartments. If the Chateau de Vaux possessed a single fault with which it could be reproached, it was its grand, pretentious character. It is even at the present day proverbial to calculate the number of acres of roofing, the restoration of which would, in our age, be the ruin of fortunes cramped and narrowed as the epoch itself. Vaux-le-Vicomte, when its magnificent gates, supported by caryatides, have been passed through, has the principal front of the main building opening upon a vast, so called, court of honor, enclosed by deep ditches, bordered by a magnificent stone balustrade. Nothing could be more noble in appearance than the central forecourt raised upon the flight of steps, like a king upon his throne, having around it four pavilions at the angles, the immense Ionic columns of which rose majestically to the whole height of the building. The friezes ornamented with arabesques, and the pediments which crowned the pilasters, conferred richness and grace on every part of the building, while the domes which surmounted the whole added proportion and majesty. This mansion, built by a subject, bore a far greater resemblance to those royal residences which Wolsey fancied he was called upon to construct, in order to present them to his master from the fear of rendering him jealous. But if magnificence and splendor were displayed in any one particular part of this palace more than another, if anything could be preferred to the wonderful arrangement of the interior, to the sumptuousness of the gilding, and to the profusion of the paintings and statues, it would be the park and gardens of Vaux. The jets d'eau, which were regarded as wonderful in 1653, are still so even at the present time. The cascades awakened the admiration of kings and princes; and as for the famous grotto, the theme of so many poetical effusions, the residence of that illustrious nymph of Vaux, whom Pelisson made converse with La Fontaine, we must be spared the description of all its beauties. We will do as Despreaux did: we will enter the park, the trees of which are of 8 years' growth only, that is to say, in their present position, and whose summits even yet, as they proudly tower aloft, blushingly unfold their leaves to the earliest rays of the rising sun. Nectar had hastened the pleasure of the Maecenas of his period; all the nursery grounds had furnished trees whose growth had been accelerated by careful culture and the richest plant food. Every tree in the neighborhood which presented a fair appearance of beauty or stature had been taken up by its roots and transplanted to the park. Fouquet could well afford to purchase trees to ornament his park, since he had bought up 3 villages and their appurtenances, to use a legal word, to increase its extent. M. de Scudery said of this palace that, for the purpose of keeping the grounds and gardens well watered, M. Fouquet had divided a river into 1,000 fountains, and gathered the water of 1,000 fountains into torrents. This same M. de Scudery had said a great many other things in his Clélie about this palace of Voltaire, the charms of which he describes most minutely. We should be far wiser to send our curious readers to Vaux, to judge for themselves, than to refer them to Clélie, and yet there are as many leagues from Paris to Vaux as there are volumes of the Clélie. This magnificent palace had been got ready for the reception of the greatest reigning sovereign of the time. M. Fouquet's friends had transported thither, some their actors and their dresses, others their troops of sculptors and artists, not forgetting others with their ready mended pens. floods of impromptus were contemplated. The cascades, somewhat rebellious nymphs though they were, poured forth their waters brighter and clearer than crystal; they scattered over the bronze Triton and Nereids their waves of foam, which glistened like fire in the rays of the sun. An army of servants were hurrying to and fro in squadrons in the courtyard and corridors, while Fouquet, who had only that morning arrived, walked all through the palace with a calm, observant glance, in order to give his last orders, after his intendants had inspected everything. It was, as we have said, the 15th of August. The sun poured down its burning rays upon the heathen deities of marble and bronze; it raised the temperature of the water in the conch shells, and ripened, on the walls, those magnificent peaches, of which the king, 50 years later, spoke so regretfully, when, at Marly, on an occasion of a scarcity of the finer sorts of peaches being complained of, in the beautiful gardens there, gardens which had cost France double the amount that had been expended on Vaux, the great king observed to some one, "You are far too young to have eaten any of M. Fouquet's peaches." O fame, O blazon of renown, O glory of this earth! That very man whose judgment was so sound and accurate where merit was concerned, he who had swept into his coffers the inheritance of Nicholas Fouquet, who had robbed him of Le Notre and Lebrun, and had sent him to rot for the remainder of his life in one of the state prisons, merely remembered the peaches of that vanquished, crushed, forgotten enemy. It was to little purpose that Fouquet had squandered 30 millions of francs in the fountains of his gardens, in the crucibles of his sculptors, in the writing desks of his literary friends, in the portfolios of his painters. Vainly had he fancied that thereby he might be remembered. A peach, a blushing, rich flavored fruit, nestling in the trellis work on the garden wall, hidden behind its long green leaves. This little vegetable production, that a dormouse would nibble up without a thought, was sufficient to recall to the memory of this great monarch the mournful shade of the last surintendant of France. With a perfect reliance that Aramis had made arrangements fairly to distribute the vast number of guests throughout the palace, and that he had not omitted to attend to any of the internal regulations for their comfort, Fouquet devoted his entire attention to the ensemble alone. In one direction Gourville showed him the preparations which had been made for the fireworks; in another, Moliere led him over the theater. At last, after he had visited the chapel, the salon, and the galleries, and was again going downstairs, exhausted with fatigue, Fouquet saw Aramis on the staircase. The prelate beckoned to him. The surintendant joined his friend, and, with him, paused before a large picture scarcely finished. Applying himself, heart and soul, to his work, the painter Lebrun, covered with perspiration, stained with paint, pale from fatigue and the inspiration of genius, was putting the last finishing touches with his rapid brush. It was the portrait of the king, whom they were expecting, dressed in the court suit which Percerin had condescended to show beforehand to the bishop of Vannes. Fouquet placed himself before this portrait, which seemed to live, as one might say, in the cool freshness of its flesh, and in its warmth of color. He gazed upon it long and fixedly, estimated the prodigious labor that had been bestowed upon it, and, not being able to find any recompense sufficiently great for this Herculean effort, he passed his arm round the painter's neck and embraced him. The surintendant by this action had utterly ruined a suit of clothes worth 1,000 pistoles, but he had satisfied, more than satisfied, Lebrun. It was a happy moment for the artist; it was an unhappy moment for M. Percerin, who was walking behind Fouquet, and was engaged in admiring, in Lebrun's painting, the suit that he had made for his majesty, a perfect objet d'art, as he called it, which was not to be matched except in the wardrobe of the surintendant. His distress and his exclamations were interrupted by a signal which had been given from the summit of the mansion. In the direction of Melun, in the still empty, open plain, the sentinels of Vaux had just perceived the advancing procession of the king and the queens. His majesty was entering Melun with his long train of carriages and cavaliers. "In an hour," said Aramis to Fouquet, "In an hour," replied the latter, sighing. "And the people who ask one another what is the good of these royal fetes?" continued the bishop of Vannes, laughing, with his false smile. "Alas! I too, who am not the people, ask myself the same thing." "I will answer you in 24 hours, monseigneur. Assume a cheerful countenance, for it should be a day of true rejoicing." "Well, believe me or not, as you like, D'Herblay," said the surintendant with a swelling heart, pointing at the cortege of Louis visible in the horizon, "he certainly loves me but very little, and I do not care much more for him; but I cannot tell you how it is, that since he is approaching my house " "Well, what?" "Well, since I know he is on his way here, as my guest, he is more sacred than ever for me; he is my acknowledged sovereign, and as such is very dear to me." "Dear, yes," said Aramis, playing upon the word, as the Abbe Terray did, at a later period, with Louis XV. "Do not laugh, D'Herblay; I feel that, if he really seemed to wish it, I could love that young man." "You should not say that to me," returned Aramis, "but rather to M. Colbert." "To M. Colbert?" exclaimed Fouquet. "Why so?" "Because he would allow you a pension out of the king's privy purse, as soon as he becomes surintendant," said Aramis, preparing to leave as soon as he had dealt this last blow. "Where are you going?" returned Fouquet, with a gloomy look. "To my own apartment, in order to change my costume, monseigneur." "Whereabouts are you lodging, D'Herblay?" "In the blue room, on the second story." "The room immediately over the king's room?" "Precisely." "You will be subject to very great restraint there. What an idea to condemn yourself to a room where you cannot stir or move about." "During the night, monseigneur, I sleep, or read in my bed." "And your servants?" "I have but one attendant with me. I find my reader quite sufficient. Adieu, monseigneur; do not over fatigue yourself. Keep yourself fresh for the arrival of the king." "We shall see you by and by, I suppose, and shall see your friend Du Vallon also?" "He is lodging next to me, and is at this moment dressing." And Fouquet, bowing, with a smile, passed on like a commander in chief who pays the different outposts a visit after the enemy has been signaled in sight. Chapter XII. The Wine of Melun. The king had, in point of fact, entered Melun with the intention of merely passing through the city. The youthful monarch was most eagerly anxious for amusements. Only twice during the journey had he been able to catch a glimpse of La Valliere, and, suspecting that his only opportunity of speaking to her would be after nightfall, in the gardens, and after the ceremony of reception had been gone through, he had been very desirous to arrive at Vaux as early as possible. But he reckoned without his captain of the musketeers, and without M. Colbert. Like Calypso, who could not be consoled at the departure of Ulysses, our Gascon could not console himself for not having guessed why Aramis had asked Percerin to show him the king's new costumes. "There is not a doubt," he said to himself, "that my friend the bishop of Vannes had some motive in that." And then he began to rack his brains most uselessly. D'Artagnan, so intimately acquainted with all the court intrigues, who knew the position of Fouquet better than even Fouquet himself did, had conceived the strangest fancies and suspicions at the announcement of the fete, which would have ruined a wealthy man, and which became impossible, utter madness even, for a man so poor as he was. And then, the presence of Aramis, who had returned from Belle Isle, and been nominated by M. Fouquet inspector general of all the arrangements, his perseverance in mixing himself up with all the surintendant's affairs, his visits to Baisemeaux, all this suspicious singularity of conduct had excessively troubled and tormented D'Artagnan during the last 2 weeks. "With men of Aramis's stamp," he said, "one is never the stronger except sword in hand. So long as Aramis continued a soldier, there was hope of getting the better of him. but since he has covered his cuirass with a stole, we are lost. But what can Aramis's object possibly be?" And D'Artagnan plunged again into deep thought. "What does it matter to me, after all," he continued, "if his only object is to overthrow M. Colbert? And what else can he be after?" And D'Artagnan rubbed his forehead, that fertile land, whence the plowshare of his nails had turned up so many and such admirable ideas in his time. He, at first, thought of talking the matter over with Colbert, but his friendship for Aramis, the oath of earlier days, bound him too strictly. He revolted at the bare idea of such a thing, and besides, he hated the financier too cordially. Then, again, he wished to unburden his mind to the king, but yet the king would not be able to understand the suspicions which had not even a shadow of reality at their base. He resolved to address himself to Aramis, direct, the first time he met him. "I will get him," said the musketeer, "between a couple of candles, suddenly, and when he least expects it, I will place my hand upon his heart, and he will tell me what will he tell me? Yes, he will tell me something, for, mordieu, there is something in it, I know." Somewhat calmer, D'Artagnan made every preparation for the journey, and took the greatest care that the military household of the king, as yet very inconsiderable in numbers, should be well officered and well disciplined in its meager and limited proportions. The result was that, through the captain's arrangements, the king, on arriving at Melun, saw himself at the head of both the musketeers and Swiss guards, as well as a picket of the French guards. It might almost have been called a small army. M. Colbert looked at the troops with great delight. He even wished they had been a third more in number. "But why?" said the king. "In order to show greater honor to M. Fouquet," replied Colbert. "In order to ruin him the sooner," thought D'Artagnan. When this little army appeared before Melun, the chief magistrates came out to meet the king, and to present him with the keys of the city, and invited him to enter the Hotel de Ville, in order to partake of the wine of honor. The king, who expected to pass through the city and to proceed to Vaux without delay, became quite red in the face from vexation. "Who was fool enough to occasion this delay?" muttered the king, between his teeth, as the chief magistrate was in the middle of a long address. "Not I, certainly," replied D'Artagnan, "but I believe it was M. Colbert." Colbert, having heard his name pronounced, said, "What was M. d'Artagnan good enough to say?" "I was good enough to remark that it was you who stopped the king's progress, so that he might taste the vin de Brie. Was I right?" "Quite so, monsieur." "In that case, then, it was you whom the king called some name or other." "What name?" "I hardly know, but wait a moment. Idiot, I think it was. No, it was fool or dolt. Yes, his majesty said that the man who had thought of the vin de Melun was something of the sort." D'Artagnan, after this broadside, quietly caressed his mustache. M. Colbert's large head seemed to become larger and larger than ever. D'Artagnan, seeing how ugly anger made him, did not stop halfway. The orator still went on with his speech, while the king's color was visibly increasing. "Mordieu!" said the musketeer, coolly, "the king is going to have an attack of determination of blood to the head. Where the deuce did you get hold of that idea, Monsieur Colbert? You have no luck." "Monsieur," said the financier, drawing himself up, "my zeal for the king's service inspired me with the idea." "Bah!" "Monsieur, Melun is a city, an excellent city, which pays well, and which it would be imprudent to displease." "There now! I, who do not pretend to be a financier, saw only one idea in your idea." "What was that, monsieur?" "That of causing a little annoyance to M. Fouquet, who is making himself quite giddy on his donjons yonder, in waiting for us." This was a home stroke, hard enough in all conscience. Colbert was completely thrown out of the saddle by it, and retired, thoroughly discomfited. Fortunately, the speech was now at an end. The king drank the wine which was presented to him, and then every one resumed the progress through the city. The king bit his lips in anger, for the evening was closing in, and all hope of a walk with La Valliere was at an end. In order that the whole of the king's household should enter Vaux, 4 hours at least were necessary, owing to the different arrangements. The king, therefore, who was boiling with impatience, hurried forward as much as possible, in order to reach it before nightfall. But, at the moment he was setting off again, other and fresh difficulties arose. "Is not the king going to sleep at Melun?" said Colbert, in a low tone of voice, to D'Artagnan. M. Colbert must have been badly inspired that day, to address himself in that manner to the chief of the musketeers, for the latter guessed that the king's intention was very far off from that of remaining where he was. D'Artagnan would not allow him to enter Vaux except he were well and strongly accompanied, and desired that his majesty would not enter except with all the escort. On the other hand, he felt that these delays would irritate that impatient monarch beyond measure. In what way could he possibly reconcile these difficulties? D'Artagnan took up Colbert's remark, and determined to repeat it to the king. "Sire," he said, "M. Colbert has been asking me if your majesty does not intend to sleep at Melun." "Sleep at Melun! What for?" exclaimed Louis XIV. "Sleep at Melun! Who, in heaven's name, can have thought of such a thing, when M. Fouquet is expecting us this evening?" "It was simply," replied Colbert, quickly, "the fear of causing your majesty the least delay; for, according to established etiquette, you cannot enter any place, with the exception of your own royal residences, until the soldiers' quarters have been marked out by the quartermaster, and the garrison properly distributed." D'Artagnan listened with the greatest attention, biting his mustache to conceal his vexation, and the queens were not less interested. They were fatigued, and would have preferred to go to rest without proceeding any farther, more especially, in order to prevent the king walking about in the evening with M. de Saint Aignan and the ladies of the court; for, if etiquette required the princesses to remain within their own rooms, the ladies of honor, as soon as they had performed the services required of them, had no restrictions placed upon them, but were at liberty to walk about as they pleased. It will easily be conjectured that all these rival interests, gathering together in vapors, necessarily produced clouds, and that the clouds were likely to be followed by a tempest. The king had no mustache to gnaw, and therefore kept biting the handle of his whip instead, with ill-concealed impatience. How could he get out of it? D'Artagnan looked as agreeable as possible, and Colbert as sulky as he could. Who was there he could get in a passion with? "We will consult the queen," said Louis XIV., bowing to the royal ladies; and this kindness of consideration softened Maria Theresa's heart, who, being of a kind and generous disposition when left to her own free will, replied, "I shall be delighted to do whatever your majesty wishes." "How long will it take us to get to Vaux?" inquired Anne of Austria, in slow and measured accents, placing her hand upon her bosom, where the seat of her pain lay. "An hour for your majesty's carriages," said D'Artagnan; "the roads are tolerably good." The king looked at him. "And a quarter of an hour for the king," he hastened to add. "We should arrive by daylight?" said Louis XIV. "But the billeting of the king's military escort," objected Colbert, softly, "will make his majesty lose all the advantage of his speed, however quick he may be." "Double ass that you are," thought D'Artagnan. "If I had any interest or motive in demolishing your credit with the king, I could do it in 10 minutes. If I were in the king's place," he added aloud, "I should, in going to M. Fouquet, leave my escort behind me; I should go to him as a friend; I should enter accompanied only by my captain of the guards." I should consider that I was acting more nobly, and should be invested with a still more sacred character by doing so." Delight sparkled in the king's eyes. "That is indeed a very sensible suggestion. We will go to see a friend as friends. The gentlemen who are with the carriages can go slowly, but we who are mounted will ride on." And he rode off, accompanied by all those who were mounted. Colbert hid his ugly head behind his horse's neck. "I shall be quits," said D'Artagnan, as he galloped along, "by getting a little talk with Aramis this evening, and then M. Fouquet is a man of honor. Mordioux! I have said so, and it must be so." And this was the way how, towards 7 o'clock in the evening, without announcing his arrival by the din of trumpets, and without even his advanced guard, without outriders or musketeers, the king presented himself before the gate of Vaux, where Fouquet, who had been informed of his royal guest's approach, had been waiting for the last half hour with his head uncovered, surrounded by his household and his friends. Chapter 13. Nectar and Ambrosia. Monsieur Fouquet held the stirrup of the king, who, having dismounted, bowed most graciously, and more graciously still held out his hand to him, which Fouquet, in spite of a slight resistance on the king's part, carried respectfully to his lips. The king wished to wait in the first courtyard for the arrival of the carriages, nor had he long to wait, for the roads had been put into excellent order by the superintendent, and a stone would hardly have been found of the size of an egg the whole way from Melun to Vaux, so that the carriages, rolling along as though on a carpet, brought the ladies to Vaux, without jolting or fatigue, by 8 o'clock. They were received by Madame Fouquet, and at the moment they made their appearance, a light as bright as day burst forth from every quarter, trees, vases, and marble statues. This species of enchantment lasted until their majesties had retired into the palace. All these wonders and magical effects which the chronicler has heaped up, or rather embalmed, in his recital, at the risk of rivaling the brain-born scenes of romancers, these splendors whereby night seemed vanquished and nature corrected, together with every delight and luxury combined for the satisfaction of all the senses, as well as the imagination, Fouquet did in real truth offer to his sovereign in that enchanting retreat, of which no monarch could at that time boast of possessing an equal. We do not intend to describe the grand banquet at which the royal guests were present, nor the concerts, nor the fairy like and more than magic transformations and metamorphoses. It will be enough for our purpose to depict the countenance the king assumed, which, from being gay, soon wore a very gloomy, constrained, and irritated expression. He remembered his own residence, royal though it was, and the mean and indifferent style of luxury that prevailed there, which comprised but little more than what was merely useful for the royal wants, without being his own personal property. The large vases of the Louvre, the older furniture and plate of Henry II., of Francis I., and of Louis XI., were but historic monuments of earlier days, nothing but specimens of art, the relics of his predecessors, while with Fouquet, the value of the article was as much in the workmanship as in the article itself. Fouquet ate from a gold service, which artists in his own employ had modeled and cast for him alone. Fouquet drank wines of which the king of France did not even know the name, and drank them out of goblets, each more valuable than the entire royal cellar. What, too, was to be said of the apartments, the hangings, the pictures, the servants and officers, of every description, of his household? What of the mode of service in which etiquette was replaced by order, stiff formality by personal, unrestrained comfort? The happiness and contentment of the guest became the supreme law of all who obeyed the host. The perfect swarm of busily engaged persons moving about noiselessly, the multitude of guests, who were, however, even less numerous than the servants who waited on them, the myriad of exquisitely prepared dishes, of gold and silver vases, the floods of dazzling light, the masses of unknown flowers of which the hothouses had been despoiled, redundant with luxuriance of unequaled scent and beauty,
the perfect harmony of the surroundings, which, indeed, was no more than the prelude of the promised fete, charmed all who were there, and they testified their admiration over and over again, not by voice or gesture, but by deep silence and rapt attention, those two languages of the courtier which acknowledge the hand of no master powerful enough to restrain them. As for the king, his eyes filled with tears; he dared not look at the queen. Anne of Austria, whose pride was superior to that of any creature breathing, overwhelmed her host by the contempt with which she treated everything handed to her. The young queen, kind hearted by nature and curious by disposition, praised Fouquet, ate with an exceedingly good appetite, and asked the names of the strange fruits as they were placed upon the table. Fouquet replied that he was not aware of their names. The fruits came from his own stores; he had often cultivated them himself, having an intimate acquaintance with the cultivation of exotic fruits and plants. The king felt and appreciated the delicacy of the replies, but was only the more humiliated. He thought the queen a little too familiar in her manners, and that Anne of Austria resembled Juno a little too much, in being too proud and haughty. His chief anxiety, however, was himself, that he might remain cold and distant in his behavior, bordering lightly the limits of supreme disdain or simple admiration. But Fouquet had foreseen all this. He was, in fact, one of those men who foresee everything. The king had expressly declared that, so long as he remained under Fouquet's roof, he did not wish his own different repasts to be served in accordance with the usual etiquette, and that he would, consequently, dine with the rest of society; but by the thoughtful attention of the surintendant, the king's dinner was served up separately, if one may so express it, in the middle of the general table. The dinner, wonderful in every respect, from the dishes of which was composed, comprised everything the king liked and generally preferred to anything else. Louis had no excuse; he, indeed, who had the keenest appetite in his kingdom, for saying that he was not hungry. Nay, M. Fouquet did even better still. He certainly, in obedience to the king's express desire, seated himself at the table; but as soon as the soups were served, he arose and personally waited on the king, while Madame Fouquet stood behind the queen mother's armchair. The disdain of Juno and the sulky fits of temper of Jupiter could not resist this excess of kindly feeling and polite attention. The queen ate a biscuit dipped in a glass of San Lucar wine, and the king ate of everything, saying to M. Fouquet, "It is impossible, monsieur le surintendant, to dine better anywhere." Whereupon the whole court began, on all sides, to devour the dishes spread before them with such enthusiasm, that it looked as though a cloud of Egyptian locusts were settling down on green and growing crops. As soon, however, as his hunger was appeased, the king became morose and overgloomed again, the more so in proportion to the satisfaction he fancied he had previously manifested, and particularly on account of the deferential manner which his courtiers had shown towards Fouquet. D'Artagnan, who ate a good deal and drank but little, without allowing it to be noticed, did not lose a single opportunity, but made a great number of observations which he turned to good profit. When the supper was finished, the king expressed a wish not to lose the promenade. The park was illuminated; the moon, too, as if she had placed herself at the orders of the Lord of Vaux, silvered the trees and lake with her own bright and quasi phosphorescent light. The air was strangely soft and balmy; the daintily shell graveled walks through the thickly set avenues yielded luxuriantly to the feet. The fete was complete in every respect, for the king, having met La Valliere in one of the winding paths of the wood, was able to press her hand and say, "I love you," without any one overhearing him except M. d'Artagnan, who followed, and M. Fouquet, who preceded him. The dreamy night of magical enchantments stole smoothly on. The king having requested to be shown to his room, there was immediately a movement in every direction. The queens passed to their own apartments, accompanied by the music of theorbos and lutes. The king found his musketeers awaiting him on the grand flight of steps, for M. Fouquet had brought them on from Melun, and had invited them to supper. D'Artagnan's suspicions at once disappeared. He was weary, he had supped well, and wished, for once in his life, thoroughly to enjoy a fete given by a man who was in every sense of the word a king. "Monsieur Fouquet," he said, "is the man for me." The king was conducted with the greatest ceremony to the chamber of Morpheus, of which we owe some cursory description to our readers. It was the handsomest and largest in the palace. Lebrun had painted on the vaulted ceiling the happy as well as the unhappy dreams which Morpheus inflicts on kings as well as on other men. Everything that sleep gives birth to that is lovely, its fairy scenes, its flowers and nectar, the wild voluptuousness or profound repose of the senses, had the painter elaborated on his frescoes. It was a composition as soft and pleasing in one part, as dark and gloomy and terrible in another. The poisoned chalice, the glittering dagger suspended over the head of the sleeper, wizards and phantoms with terrific masks, those half dim shadows more alarming than the approach of fire, or the somber face of midnight, these, and such as these, he had made the companions of his more pleasing pictures. No sooner had the king entered his room than a cold shiver seemed to pass through him, and on Fouquet asking him the cause of it, the king replied, as pale as death, "I am sleepy, that is all." "Does your majesty wish for your attendants at once?" "No, I have to talk with a few persons first," said the king. "Will you have the goodness to tell M. Colbert that I wish to see him?" Fouquet bowed and left the room. Chapter 14. A Gascon and a Gascon and a half. D'Artagnan had determined to lose no time, and in fact he never was in the habit of doing so. After having inquired for Aramis, he had looked for him in every direction until he had succeeded in finding him. Besides, no sooner had the king entered Vaux than Aramis had retired to his own room, meditating, doubtless, some new piece of gallant attention for his majesty's amusement. D'Artagnan desired the servants to announce him, and found on the second story, in a beautiful room called the Blue Chamber, on account of the color of its hangings, the Bishop of Vannes, in company with Porthos and several of the modern Epicureans. Aramis came forward to embrace his friend, and offered him the best seat. As it was after a while generally remarked among those present that the musketeer was reserved, and wished for an opportunity for conversing secretly with Aramis, the Epicureans took their leave. Porthos, however, did not stir, for true it is that, having dined exceedingly well, he was fast asleep in his armchair, and the freedom of conversation therefore was not interrupted by a third person. Porthos had a deep, harmonious snore, and people might talk in the midst of its loud bass without fear of disturbing him. D'Artagnan felt that he was called upon to open the conversation. "Well, and so we have come to Vaux," he said. "Why, yes, D'Artagnan; and how do you like the place?" "Very much, and I like Monsieur Fouquet also." "Is he not a charming host?" "No one could be more so." "I am told that the king began by showing great distance of manner towards Monsieur Fouquet, but that his majesty grew much more cordial afterwards." "You did not notice it, then, since you say you have been told so?" "No, I was engaged with the gentlemen who have just left the room about the theatrical performances and the tournaments, which are to take place to morrow." "Ah, indeed! You are the comptroller general of the fetes here, then?" "You know I am a friend of all kinds of amusement where the exercise of the imagination is called into activity. I have always been a poet in one way or another." "Yes, I remember the verses you used to write; they were charming." "I have forgotten them, but I am delighted to read the verses of others, when those others are known by the names of Moliere, Pelisson, La Fontaine, etc." Do you know what idea occurred to me this evening, Aramis?" "No, tell me what it is, for I should never be able to guess it, you have so many." "Well, the idea occurred to me that the true king of France is not Louis XIV." "What!" said Aramis, involuntarily, looking the musketeer full in the eyes. "No, it is M. Fouquet." Aramis breathed again, and smiled. "Ah! you are like all the rest, jealous," he said. "I would wager that it was M. Colbert who turned that pretty phrase." D'Artagnan, in order to throw Aramis off his guard, related Colbert's misadventures with regard to the vin de Melun. "He comes of a mean race, does Colbert," said Aramis. "Quite true." "When I think, too," added the bishop, "that that fellow will be your minister within 4 months, and that you will serve him as blindly as you did Richelieu or Mazarin." "And as you serve M. Fouquet," said D'Artagnan. "With this difference, though, that M. Fouquet is not M. Colbert." "True, true," said D'Artagnan, as he pretended to become sad and full of reflection; and then, a moment after, he added, "Why do you tell me that M. Colbert will be minister in 4 months?" "Because M. Fouquet will have ceased to be so," replied Aramis. "He will be ruined, you mean?" said D'Artagnan. "Completely so." "Why does he give these fetes, then?" said the musketeer, in a tone so full of thoughtful consideration, and so well assumed, that the bishop was for the moment deceived by it. "Why did you not dissuade him from it?" The latter part of the phrase was just a little too much, and Aramis's former suspicions were again aroused. "It is done with the object of humoring the king." "By ruining himself?" "Yes, by ruining himself for the king." "A most eccentric, one might say, sinister calculation, that." "Necessity, necessity, my friend." "I don't see that, dear Aramis." "Do you not? Have you not remarked M. Colbert's daily increasing antagonism, and that he is doing his utmost to drive the king to get rid of the superintendent?" "One must be blind not to see it." "And that a cable is already armed against M. Fouquet?" "That is well known." "What likelihood is there that the king would join a party formed against a man who will have spent everything he had to please him?" "True." "True," said D'Artagnan, slowly, hardly convinced, yet curious to broach another phase of the conversation. "There are follies and follies," he resumed, "and I do not like those you are committing." "What do you allude to?" "As for the banquet, the ball, the concert, the theatricals, the tournaments, the cascades, the fireworks, the illuminations, and the presents, these are well and good, I grant; but why were not these expenses sufficient? Why was it necessary to have new liveries and costumes for your whole household?" "You are quite right. I told M. Fouquet that myself. He replied, that if he were rich enough he would offer the king a newly erected chateau, from the vanes at the houses to the very subcellars, completely new inside and out; and that, as soon as the king had left, he would burn the whole building and its contents, in order that it might not be made use of by any one else." "How completely Spanish!" "I told him so, and he then added this: 'Whoever advises me to spare expense, I shall look upon as my enemy.'" "It is positive madness! And that portrait, too!" "What portrait?" said Aramis. "That of the king, and the surprise as well." "What surprise?" "The surprise you seemed to have in view, and on account of which you took some specimens away, when I met you at Percerin's." D'Artagnan paused. The shaft was discharged, and all he had to do was wait and watch its effect. "That is merely an act of graceful attention," replied Aramis. D'Artagnan went up to his friend, took hold of both his hands, and looking him full in the eyes, said, "Aramis, do you still care for me a very little?" "What a question to ask!" "Very good. One favor, then. Why did you take some patterns of the king's costumes at Percerin's?" "Come with me and ask poor Lebrun, who has been working upon them for the last 2 days and nights." "Aramis, that may be truth for everybody else, but for me " "Upon my word, D'Artagnan, you astonish me." "Be a little considerate. Tell me the exact truth. You would not like anything disagreeable to happen to me, would you?" "My dear friend, you are becoming quite incomprehensible. What suspicion can you have possibly got hold of?" "Do you believe in my instinctive feelings? Formerly you used to have faith in them. Well, then, an instinct tells me that you have some concealed project on foot." "I, a project?" "I am convinced of it." "What nonsense!" "I am not only sure of it, but I would even swear it." "Indeed, D'Artagnan, you cause me the greatest pain. Is it likely, if I have any project in hand that I ought to keep secret from you, I should tell you about it? If I had one that I could and ought to have revealed, should I not have long ago divulged it?" "No, Aramis, no. There are certain projects which are never revealed until the favorable opportunity arrives." "In that case, my dear fellow," returned the bishop, laughing, "the only thing now is, that the opportunity has not yet arrived." D'Artagnan shook his head with a sorrowful expression. "Oh, friendship, friendship!" he said. "What an idle word you are! Here is a man who, if I were but to ask it, would suffer himself to be cut in pieces for my sake." "You are right," said Aramis, nobly. "And this man, who would shed every drop of blood in his veins for me, will not open up before me the least corner in his heart. Friendship, I repeat, is nothing but an unsubstantial shadow, a lure, like everything else in this bright, dazzling world." "It is not thus you should speak of our friendship," replied the bishop in a firm, assured voice, "for ours is not of the same nature as those of which you have been speaking." "Look at us, Aramis. 3 out of the old 4. You are deceiving me, I suspect you, and Porthos is fast asleep. An admirable trio of friends, don't you think so? What an affecting relic of the former dear old times!" "I can only tell you one thing, D'Artagnan, and I swear it on the Bible. I love you just as I used to do. If I ever suspect you, it is on account of others, and not on account of either of us. In everything I may do, and should happen to succeed in, you will find your fourth. Will you promise me the same favor?" "If I am not mistaken, Aramis, your words, at the moment you pronounce them, are full of generous feeling." "Such a thing is very possible." "You are conspiring against M. Colbert. If that be all, mordioux, tell me so at once. I have the instrument in my own hand, and will pull out the tooth easily enough." Aramis could not conceal a smile of disdain that flitted over his haughty features. "And supposing that I were conspiring against Colbert, what harm would there be in that?" "No, no, that would be too trifling a matter for you to take in hand; and it was not on that account you asked Percerin for those patterns of the king's costumes. Oh! Aramis, we are not enemies, remember; we are brothers. Tell me what you wish to undertake, and upon the word of a D'Artagnan, if I cannot help you, I will swear to remain neuter." "I am undertaking nothing," said Aramis. "Aramis, a voice within me speaks, and seems to trickle forth a rill of light within my darkness. It is a voice that has never yet deceived me. It is the king you are conspiring against." "The king!" exclaimed the bishop, pretending to be annoyed. Your face will not convince me. The king, I repeat." "Will you help me?" said Aramis, smiling ironically. "Aramis, I will do more than help you, I will do more than remain neuter, I will save you." "You are mad, D'Artagnan." "I am the wiser of the two in this matter." "You to suspect me of wishing to assassinate the king?" "Who spoke of such a thing?" smiled the musketeer. "Well, let us understand one another. I do not see what any one can do to a legitimate king as ours is, if he does not assassinate him." D'Artagnan did not say a word. "Besides, you have your guards and your musketeers here," said the bishop. "True." "You are not in M. Fouquet's house, but in your own." "True; but in spite of that, Aramis, grant me, for pity's sake, one single word of a true friend." "A true friend's word is ever truth itself. If I think of touching, even with my finger, the son of Anne of Austria, the true king of this realm of France, if I have not the firm intention of prostrating myself before his throne, if in every idea I may entertain to morrow, here at Vaux, will not be the most glorious day my king ever enjoyed, may heaven's lightning blast me where I stand." Aramis had pronounced these words with his face turned toward the alcove of his own bedroom, where D'Artagnan, seated with his back towards the alcove, could not suspect that any one was lying concealed. The earnestness of his words, the studied slowness with which he pronounced them, the solemnity of his oath, gave the musketeer the most complete satisfaction. He took hold of both Aramis's hands and shook them cordially. Aramis had endured reproaches without turning pale, and had blushed as he listened to words of praise. D'Artagnan, deceived, did him honor; but D'Artagnan, trustful and reliant, made him feel ashamed. "Are you going away?" he said, as he embraced him in order to conceal the flush on his face. "Yes, duty summons me. I have to get the watchword. It seems I am to be lodged in the king's ante room. Where does Porthos sleep?" "Take him away with you, if you like, for he rumbles through his sleepy nose like a park of artillery." "Ah! he does not stay with you, then?" said D'Artagnan. "Not the least in the world. He has a chamber to himself, but I don't know where." "Very good," said the musketeer, from whom this separation of the two associates removed his last suspicion; and he touched Porthos lightly on the shoulder. The latter replied by a loud yawn. "Come," said D'Artagnan. "What! Ah! D'Artagnan, my dear fellow, is that you? What a lucky chance! Ah, yes! True, I have forgotten. I am at the fete at Vaux." "Yes, and your beautiful dress, too." "Yes, it was very attentive on the part of M. Coquelin de Voliere, was it not?" "Hush!" said Aramis. "You are walking so heavily you will make the flooring give way." "True," said the musketeer; "this room is above the dome, I think." "And I did not choose it for a fencing room, I assure you," added the bishop. "The ceiling of the king's room has all the lightness and calm of wholesome sleep. Do not forget, therefore, that my flooring is merely the covering of his ceiling. Good night, my friends, and in 10 minutes I shall be asleep myself." And Aramis accompanied them to the door, laughing quietly all the while. As soon as they were outside, he bolted the door, hurriedly, closed up the chinks of the windows, and then called out, "Monseigneur! Monseigneur!" Philippe made his appearance from the alcove, as he pushed aside a sliding panel placed behind the bed. "Monsieur d'Artagnan entertains a great many suspicions, it seems," he said. "Ah! you recognize M. d'Artagnan, then?" "Before you called him by his name, even." "He is your captain of musketeers." "He is very devoted to me," replied Philippe, laying a stress upon the personal pronoun. "As faithful as a dog; but he bites sometimes. If D'Artagnan does not recognize you before The other has disappeared. Rely upon D'Artagnan to the end of the world, for in that case, if he has seen nothing, he will keep his fidelity. If he sees when it is too late, he is a Gascon, and will never admit that he has been deceived." "I thought so. What are we to do now?" "Sit in this folding chair. I am going to push aside a portion of the flooring; you will look through the opening, which answers to one of the false windows made in the dome of the king's apartment." "Can you see?" "Yes," said Philippe, starting as at the sight of an enemy. "I see the king." "What is he doing?" "He seems to wish some man to sit down close to him." "Monsieur Fouquet?" "No, no, wait a moment." "Look at the notes and the portraits, my prince." "The man whom the king wishes to sit down in his presence is M. Colbert." "Colbert sit down in the king's presence!" exclaimed Aramis. "It is impossible." "Look." Aramis looked through the opening in the floor. "Yes," he said, "Colbert himself. Oh, monseigneur, what can we be going to hear, and what can result from this intimacy?" "Nothing good for M. Fouquet, at all events." The prince did not deceive himself. We have seen that Louis XIV. Had sent for Colbert, and Colbert had arrived. The conversation began between them by the king according to him one of the highest favors that he had ever done. It was true the king was alone with his subject. "Colbert," said he, "sit down." The intendant, overcome with delight, for he feared he was about to be dismissed, refused this unprecedented honor. "Does he accept?" said Aramis. "No, he remains standing." "Let us listen, then." And the future king and the future pope listened eagerly to the simple mortals they held under their feet, ready to crush them when they liked. "Colbert," said the king, "you have annoyed me exceedingly to day." "I know it, sire." "Very good, I like that answer. Yes, you knew it, and there was courage in the doing of it." "I ran the risk of displeasing your majesty, but I risked also the concealment of your best interests." "What! you were afraid of something on my account?" "I was, sire, even if it were nothing more than an indigestion," said Colbert; "for people do not give their sovereign such banquets as the one of to day, unless it be to stifle them beneath the burden of good living." Colbert awaited the effect this coarse jest would produce upon the king, and Louis XIV., who was the vainest and the most fastidiously delicate man in his kingdom, forgave Colbert the joke. "The truth is," he said, "that M. Fouquet has given me too good a meal. Tell me, Colbert, where does he get all the money required for this enormous expenditure? Can you tell?" "Yes, I do know, sire." "Will you be able to prove it with tolerable certainty?" "Easily, and to the utmost farthing." "I know you are very exact." "Exactitude is the principal qualification required in an intendant of finances." "But all are not so." "I thank your majesty for so flattering a compliment from your own lips." "M. Fouquet, therefore, is rich, very rich, and I suppose every man knows he is so." "Every one, sire, the living as well as the dead." "What does that mean, Monsieur Colbert?" "The living are witnesses of M. Fouquet's wealth; they admire and applaud the result produced. But the dead, wiser and better informed than we are, know how that wealth was obtained, and they rise up in accusation." "So that M. Fouquet owes his wealth to some cause or other." "The occupation of an intendant very often favors those who practice it." You have something to say to me more confidentially, I perceive. Do not be afraid, we are quite alone." "I am never afraid of anything under the shelter of my own conscience, and under the protection of your majesty," said Colbert, bowing. "If the dead, therefore, were to speak " "They do speak sometimes, sire. Read." "Ah!" murmured Aramis in the prince's ear, beside him, listened without losing a syllable. "Since you are placed here, monseigneur, in order to learn your vocation of a king, listen to a piece of infamy, of a nature truly royal. You are about to be a witness of one of those scenes which the foul fiend alone conceives and executes. Listen attentively, you will find your advantage in it." The prince redoubled his attention, and saw Louis XIV. Take from Colbert's hands a letter the latter held out to him. "The late cardinal's handwriting," said the king. "Your majesty has an excellent memory," replied Colbert, bowing. "It is an immense advantage for a king who is destined for hard work to recognize handwritings at the first glance." The king read Mazarin's letter, and as its contents are already known to the reader, in consequence of the misunderstanding between Madame de Chevreuse and Aramis, nothing further would be learned if we stated them here again. "I do not quite understand," said the king, greatly interested. "Your majesty has not acquired the utilitarian habit of checking the public accounts." "I see that it refers to money that has been given to M. Fouquet." 13 millions! A tolerably good sum." "Yes. Well, these 13 millions are wanting to balance the total of the account. That is what I do not very well understand. How was this deficit possible?" "Possible, I do not say; but there is no doubt about fact that it is really so." "You say that these 13 millions are found to be wanting in the accounts?" "I do not say so, but the registry does." "And this letter of M. Mazarin indicates the employment of that sum, and the name of the person with whom it was deposited?" "As your majesty can judge for yourself." "Yes. And the result is, then, that M. Fouquet has not yet restored the 13 millions." "That results from the accounts, certainly, sire." "Well, and consequently?" "Well, sire, in that case, inasmuch as M. Fouquet has not given back the 13 millions, he must have appropriated them to his own purpose; and with those 13 millions one could incur 4 times and a little more as much expense, and make 4 times as great a display, as your majesty was able to do at Fontainebleau, where we only spent 3 millions altogether, if you remember." For a blunderer, the souvenir he had evoked was a rather skillfully contrived piece of baseness, for by remembrance of his own fete he, for the first time, perceived its inferiority compared with that of Fouquet. Colbert received back again at Vaux what Fouquet had given him at Fontainebleau, and, as a good financier, returned it with the best possible interest. Having once disposed the king's mind in this artful way, Colbert had nothing of much importance to detain him. He felt that such was the case, for the king, too, had again sunk into a dull and gloomy state. Colbert awaited the first words from the king's lips with as much impatience as Philippe and Aramis did from their place of observation. "Are you aware what is the usual and natural consequence of all this, Monsieur Colbert?" said the king, after a few moments' reflection. "No, sire, I do not know." "Well, then, the fact of the appropriation of the 13 millions, if it can be proved " "But it is so already." "I mean if it were to be declared and certified, Monsieur Colbert."
"I think it will be to morrow, if your majesty
"Were we not under M. Fouquet's roof, you were going to say, perhaps," replied the king, with something of nobility in his demeanor. "The king is in his own palace wherever he may be, especially in houses which the royal money has constructed." "I think," said Philippe in a low tone to Aramis, "that the architect who planned this dome ought, anticipating the use it could be put to at a future opportunity, so to have contrived that it might be made to fall upon the heads of scoundrels such as M. Colbert." "I think so too," replied Aramis; "but M. Colbert is so very near the king at the moment." "That is true, and that would open the succession." "Of which your younger brother would reap all the advantage, monseigneur. But stay, let us keep quiet, and go on listening." "We shall not have long to listen," said the young prince. "Why not, monseigneur?" "Because, if I were king, I should make no further reply." "And what would you do?" "I should wait until to morrow morning to give myself time for reflection." Louis XIV. At last raised his eyes, and finding Colbert attentively waiting for his next remarks, said hastily, changing the conversation, "Monsieur Colbert, I perceive it is getting very late, and I shall now retire to bed. By to morrow morning I shall have made up my mind." "Very good, sire," returned Colbert, greatly incensed, though he restrained himself in the presence of the king. The king made a gesture of adieu, and Colbert withdrew with a respectful bow. "My attendants!" cried the king; and as they entered the apartment, Philippe was about to quit his post of observation. "A moment longer," said Aramis to him, with his accustomed gentleness of manner. "What has just now taken place is only a detail, and to morrow we shall have no occasion to think anything more about it. But the ceremony of the king's retiring to rest, the etiquette observed in addressing the king, that indeed is of the greatest importance. Learn, sire, and study well how you ought to go to bed of a night. Look, look!"